How influential were Bristolian female poets in the abolition of the slave trade? We started by creating a spider diagram to accumulate all our ideas and see how they were linked in order to help us decide what rabbit hole we wanted to pursue. Within the work for weeks 2 and 3, we studied the topic of forced labour, learning about the Bristol transatlantic slave trade and the personal stories of some individuals. Some of these portrayed horrific experiences which Black individuals had to undergo at the time. In week 3, the work had us looking at the BLM protests which took place in Bristol, with a notable focus on Edward Colston due to his statue being taken down and thrown into the port. After completing this work, we became very interested in looking at the abolition of the slave trade itself, and more specifically the role of women within this movement. As despite names like Wordsworth and Wilberforce appearing frequently, we found very little mention and gaps in academic sources with information about female activists within Bristol.
We wanted to start by ensuring we had a strong bank of information around the abolition of the slave trade in Bristol and see if any female names came up during this. In 1788, following a visit by abolitionist Tom Clarkson, Bristol became the first city outside of London to set up a committee for the abolition of the slave trade, which played an important role in the Slave Trade Act passed by Parliament in 1807, despite the fact it did remain legal in the British Empire until 1833.
Following this initial inquiry, we wanted to go on and uncover why there was so little mention of women and their role. In order to achieve this, we researched what role did women play in the abolition of the slave trade in Bristol, in order to find names and events which we hoped could help us delve deeper into the rabbit hole. We followed this up with more specific questions, including what are their backgrounds, how did they influence the abolition, and was their role of particular importance or significance. These searches were successful in uncovering 2 key names, Hannah More and Anne Yearsley, both of whom were Bristolian women and poets.
Then we looked back over materials from week 2 and 3 again, this time in order to gain access to different types of source materials, such as diaries, monetary records, newspapers, and academic literature. The key piece of literature we found was a book called Slavery Obscured, The Social History of the Slave Trade in an English Provincial Port by Bristol historian Madge Dresser, in which Dresser noted the significance of Hannah More during the abolition period.
We then decided we wanted to look at the 2 poets individually in detail, starting with Hannah More. Born at Fish Ponds near Bristol, it was in 1787 she first met William Wilberforce, when they established a friendship over their shared commitment to evangelical Christianity and a belief the slave trade was a corruption at the heart of the nation's life. Together, with other key abolitionists, their work had a crucial role in giving the cause of abolition a voice. Throughout her work, notably in Slavery, a Poem, she worked to persuade her readers and listeners to adopt an anti-slavery position, and was also used as part of Wilberforce's parliamentary campaign to achieve abolition. As a Bristolian, she was influential as a playwright initially, before going on to found a school for young women, and in her later years establishing Sunday school.
Next, we went on to look at Anne Yearsley. Coming from a poor family and being self-educated, Anne Yearsley from a young age wanted to help people discriminated against. Amongst her writings were poems on Bristol's slave trade. One reads, "When I sell a son, sweet heavens, let it be my own." Yearsley is saying to God that if she has to sell a child, it would be better it be her own rather than that of another woman. It was a criticism of the buying and selling of African children in slavery, showing her opposition towards it. She was also one of the few working class women in the era to gain prominence as a writer, with her most known piece being a poem on the inhumanity of the slave trade.
Whilst we had been successful in finding this information regarding Bristol, we wanted to research similar events which may have occurred at different spatial locations, using names and dates we already knew. We found dates for abolitions in other areas such as London in 1833 and Liverpool in 1807, showing Bristol was well ahead of the curve with its condemnation of the slave trade. Other significant women who came up in our searches include Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, who, like Yeardsley and Moore, wrote anti-slavery stories, one of which was called The Sylph, and Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a sociologist and political advocate, who famously said, "It's one half of the human species, like the poor African slaves, to be subjected to prejudice that brutalized them, only to sweeten the cup of men."
Here are two of the key academic articles which aided our line of inquiry, the first from Dresser and the second by Marshall. These articles illustrate the importance that women played during the abolition period and show how simple changes in demand, such as boycotting slave-produced sugar, had great influence.
For the next part of our rabbit hole, we decided to collect priority data to see if we could develop our understanding of female poets in the Bristol abolition slave trade. The virtual walking tour around Bristol showed us the type of work that was done and indicated to us that women were not very prominent in these areas, as it would have been unlikely to see women working these types of jobs at the time. The M Shed we visited in hopes to find women's stories or poems in order to get more information on particular occurrences or dates. We also looked out for pubs, street art and plaques of historical female figures, which could help us piece together more of a complete story. If we had the opportunity to take our research further, we would have conducted interviews with relatives of female poets to see if they could tell us about their emotional experiences and what information they had. If we could find out what support they had from other women, we could understand on a deeper level how wide of a follower reach they had and how much of a difference they would have made.
Next, we wanted to focus in on the information we had found and what we expected to find, that we did find, and what was missing. We were able to find evidence of female poets and writers in contributing to anti-slavery activism, yet we found little to no evidence of any non-white female poets or writers who had contributed. That's not to say there weren't any, but there is a lack of evidence which could be a result of a plethora of reasons. As a result of our work in topics in week 4 and 5, we know there were pivotal women in the Bristol Boss boycott, so we can believe they would have fought for their rights and beliefs passionately where possible.
To summarise, we began with a basic Google search to find if there was in fact influential women in the movement for the abolition. We then decided we wanted to delve deeper into who these women really were by reading poems and articles about their work to establish their character. Following this, we looked deeper into the history and background of both women before looking at other similar events or people that could aid the understanding of the widespread support and agreement.
This took us onto the use of primary data and how we use it to gain a more well-rounded and in-depth knowledge on the topic, with information we couldn't have collected from secondary sources. Lastly, we then took the time to notice what was missing from our research, deciding how we'd take our rabbit hole further or even develop a new line of inquiry. Overall, we found women, and in particular female writers, did have a very large influence on the abolition of the slave trade, and they showed their support to the start of the movement of freedom, which was supported by many others around Bristol.